All right, we're going to start Matthew chapter 18, and with God's favor, we'll finish chapter 19. Let's see how we go through. All right, I'm just going to dive in, chapter 18, verse 1. That time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child, whom he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If any of you cause one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it'd be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of things that cause sin. Such things are bound to come, but woe to the one through whom they come." Who's the greatest? Now, in the other gospel accounts, you hear the disciples, remember they were all boys, so, which one of us do you love the most? Which one of us, is the fastest? Even in one of the gospel accounts of the resurrection, it seems clear that the gospel writer wanted to say, I got to the tomb before Peter did. Boys want to be first. Boys want to be the greatest. So they're asking this question. But it doesn't appear to be so much about contest or competitiveness among the boy disciples in this case. We think about the question of the greatest in the kingdom because the greatest, idea of the greatest, the concept, is always about the good life. It's about the way that we're supposed to live. What do we value the most? What is greatest in your opinion, Jesus? It's a different kingdom, God's kingdom, than the kingdom of the world. In the world, it's about riches or power or importance or status. But again, you find Jesus with his frequent reversal of values. The last shall be first. The greatest is the least among you, the most humble. And to have that as an object lesson, an example was found right among them. Jesus saw a child. Remember, I often repeat these very simple sentences. Jesus saw people, right? The child was the person that was so often overlooked in that culture. It's hard for us to imagine that. We love our children and our grandchildren, right? Our great-grandchildren. Maybe you like the grands the best. Somebody said to me once, if I knew grandchildren would be this great, I'd have them first, right? So in our culture, we love children. Only because of Jesus, I say. He changed the world by lifting up the lowly child as someone to pay attention to. In fact, to become like, as a moment of inspiration here. Be humble like a child, he teaches. The kingdom of heaven is not like the world's kingdom, which is a pyramid. The greatest people are on top. There's only room for a few at the top of the pyramid of status, hierarchy, power, and wealth. Jesus basically is saying, rather, become like nobodies. People who are not concerned about their status or their wealth, but trusting and dependent upon their Father like a child. It may also mean be content to be among or considered like the least of these. Not only children, but other people in society who are at the bottom of the pyramid of the world's kingdom. Be willing to be among humble or humiliated people like this. Even with all these miracles you've witnessed, he seems to be saying to these disciples, don't get caught up in the great power and the great actions that I'm doing as if that'll make you great. Rather, be humble, be like a servant, and be willing to be counted among the nobodies, the least of these around us. Now, also understand that back then, children were either overlooked or looked down upon, literally. Even parents, you kind of learned not to get too emotionally invested in your child. Many of them don't live to 5 years of age, okay? And so they were thought of more like second-class citizens or even servants, to get certain menial tasks done depending on their age. So again, it accentuates Jesus' reversal of values, that greatness is found in humility, in meekness, or in being small. But also, I think, I'll say it again, being childlike is not childish as I act sometimes, but being childlike is to trust God always. We can't do it on our own. Like a child, we have to be dependent upon our loving parent, God our Father. Verse 8, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. You know, right now, if you had heard this for the very first time, you would just be shocked. But you know, you and I have grown up with this gospel in the church and everything. You've probably heard a lot of indications about what this must have meant. But it was shocking. Better for you to enter life maimed than to have 2 hands, 2 feet be thrown into the eternal fire. If your eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. Better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the hell of fire. Real quick note, because we've talked a little bit about the eternal fire or the hell of fire in this case. The Greek word Gehenna is not the word hell or Hades is used there, but Gehenna is the burning of trash outside the city walls. So it was the landfill. So you don't have to hear this as so heavy-handed, doom, gloom, lightning bolts of judgment. I prefer composting or recycling. You know, that God will show us there is a way of judgment. But it actually doesn't say hell. It says hell in our English translation. Keep it simple. But let's go back to the shocking part. You know, the idea of a fire burning that which is not good was not shocking to them. You know, it was just part of their life. But the idea of cutting off your own foot because it caused you to stumble, what is with Jesus, the great physician, prescribing such radical surgery? Right? I mean, you know, that does not sound like a good healing. I mean, this is a man known for healing and for his compassion. What is happening here? Again, remember that Jesus uses hyperbole. He uses exaggerate. Have you ever heard of a preacher exaggerating or making a lot out of a little? There was no way. I mean, you could raise your voice. You could repeat yourself, but there was no way to have a headline or a banner line like we have in print or TV or things like that. So he had to use, as the prophet would use, some shocking words. All of this is to say Jesus takes sin very seriously. We should take sin very seriously. Those disciples walked all the way to the cross with Jesus and jumped up and down for joy at the resurrection. So they did not take his words literally in this case. He's not saying we should cut off feet. You know, he wants us to be 2-footed and following him along the way as well. So it's a way that we can understand the seriousness of sin, but not be tripping over the literal words that he used. Verse 10, take care that you do not despise one of these little ones. So immediately we think little ones is referring to the children again. Sure, that's quite possible. But he's equating the little ones, as the children, as representative of the little ones in society, the least of these, the humblest of people. So it can refer to all of them. For I tell you, in heaven their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep, one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of that one that went astray? And if he finds it, verse 13, he says, if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. Now, this is, we know, the parable of the lost sheep. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. But that's a theme that's a bit more clear in Luke. And Luke's gospel includes this parable of the lost sheep in a string of other parables of the lost coin, the lost son, we call it the prodigal son, and so on. Jesus may be referring to children, but he's also saying whoever is left out of society, you know, whoever seems to not count, the least, the last, the lost, Jesus has come to seek them. Yes, and here's where I think it may be a little bit new for you. You can also interpret it this way. Jesus he's making a prelude here because he's about to do a lot of teaching about what it is to be reconciling with people in church. And he uses the word church again, which is very infrequently used in the gospel. We're so used to it now. But understand that he's talking about the little ones, these who like Jesus' disciples, consider themselves to be humble like children and are following Jesus along the way. Some of them are going to go astray, and the shepherd will continue to look for them if he finds. In Luke's account, it's when the shepherd finds the sheep, and it's that definite. But what Jesus seems to be saying here is that among the believers even, some are going to go astray, some will come back and be reconciled, others will not. Others will stay astray. So understand that the life of the community of believers, the church, is going to be complicated like this. Be open and active to reconciling believers who've gone astray, but when they don't come back, be ready for that as well. That fits with what comes next, verse 15. If your brother or sister sins against you, go out and point out the fault that when the two of you are alone. If you are listened to, you've regained that one. If you're not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If that person refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. There's that word church, so infrequent, maybe 3 times in the Gospels. Tell it to the church, and if the offender refuses to listen to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Verse 18, truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. There's one of the most beautiful verses. We hear that verse. We know that one very well. But don't take it out of context so much as help you understand the rest of the context with that verse. So let's think about this carefully. Jesus is teaching here about reconciling relationships. Jesus is human. He's called 12 men, young men, to follow him. So he knows something about human nature for sure. I don't know if you've ever had a boy in your family, or maybe some of you ladies fell in love with a boy at one time. Maybe some of you listening, like me, you were a boy at one point or another. And I don't mean to accentuate the gender part of this. It's just that, yeah, there's going to be some conflict. There's going to be conflict among these disciples, just the 12 men. And then Jesus certainly is inferring everybody, human relationships. If you've got any human beings in your life, you've probably had some strife, some struggle, some disappointments, some debate, or conflict. Some people maybe even have experienced a broken relationship, a falling out where you just can't seem to get back together with that person. You cannot pick up the phone. You cannot seem to bring yourself to even say good morning anymore. You know the pains that I'm talking about. Jesus is referring to this, but listen to his strange teaching. Again, almost like a radical surgery for psychology. Not cutting off your foot, but if your brother sins against you, brother or sister has offended you, what do? Well, I'm not going to speak to them. They owe me what? An apology. So you treat with the cold shoulder, silent treatment, those sorts of things. That's what that's human nature. But Jesus doesn't say that. If you've been offended, guess what? The ball's in your court. You go to them. Oh, slip up a hand. Don't we all do this? This absolutely is exactly what we do. No. No, we tend to, return an insult for an insult, right? Eye for an eye. A slight for a slight. Anyway, I think you follow me here. She said such rude words to me. I'm just not going to speak to her anymore. I guess we're not friends. But Jesus is saying, go out there and talk it out. Go approach that person. He didn't give you the exact language, but you could go to that person and say something like, maybe you didn't mean but I heard you say, and that was, hard for me to hear that. I was surprised by that. And you can go and just bring that subject up and start to talk it out. Maybe you've done that work before. This is the work of actively seeking to reconcile. And a lot of times it doesn't work. So Jesus has actually given 3 steps here. First, you go one-on-one, go privately. Right? Nobody wants to be chastised in front of somebody else. Nobody wants to be doing this difficult emotional work or relationship work with an audience. But if it doesn't work one-on-one, take another friend or two with you. And Jesus is saying this is among the community of believers. So this is among the church. And here it's very plain. The third step would be, if you can't do it in a small group, and you couldn't do it privately, then bring it to the church, presumably the church leadership. You're not going to stand up right after the sermon and say, Susie just really ran me under the bus. But the church would have a role the way that Jesus instructed to begin with. The church would have a role in trying to reconcile relationships. Not as common in our day and time, but that's what Jesus was saying. And that if the church leadership could not help that person to reconcile, then, listen to this, it's fascinating, verse 17, let him be as a Gentile or a tax collector. Now, what is that? Is that saying outsider forever? Is that an insult? Tax collectors were seen as traitors, were seen as, the worst of sinners. They actually were the very objects of Jesus' evangelism and compassionate outreach, right? So even the person, after refusing to be reconciled, shouldn't be shunned, but should be, what? The object of our compassionate outreach and care still. So maybe it's, keep them on your prayer list and be open to them coming back and being reconciled. And then Jesus repeats what he had said in chapter 16 a bit about binding and loosing. Those are words, rabbis and the Jewish religion very familiar with these words. It was about allowing, permitting, or prohibiting, right? Binding or loosing, prohibiting or permitting something. And that the church had this leadership role of talking about, as we discern the way that Jesus taught us, here's how this should look. Here's how it should work out. And then it is punctuated. The final part of this part is verse 20, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. So it's not that we use 2 or 3 are gathered like I do, just so loosely, out of context all the time. It's part of the reconciling work among believers to have loving and right relationships so that the whole church can be a witness to others, so that others can see that how we say this is the right way to go, it helps us to live in harmony. And that's exactly what these words talk about, with Jesus being there among us, just 2 or 3 agreeing on something. The word agree in verse 19, it's the Greek word where we get our English word symphony. Symphony. So it's about we together are in harmony with the presence of Christ among us. And we can work relationships that have the potential, at least, to be reconciled. See, in our day and time, this is difficult. We tend to think of our situation, our relationship and behavior, mistakes or sins, only in the private realm, just between you and God alone. And while we're all more comfortable with that, the teachings of Jesus show us that sin is something that is interpersonal. It affects relationships among people. It affects the community of believers, and we have to take that into account on one level or another. Here's one way to do it. Jesus goes on. I'll call this passage the calculus of grace. Any math fans out there? Anybody like math? Okay. Peter's going to do a little math lesson here for us with forgiveness. Now, verse 21, Peter said to Jesus, Lord, if my brother or sister sins against me, how often should I forgive? Very practical question, right? Because Jesus was talking about if you're offended by somebody sinning against you, speaking against you, something like that, right? Then the ball's in your court. Well, then Peter starts to ask what you probably would ask, or I would ask next. Well, wait a minute. Where's the limit, right? Let's do a little calculation. Peter says, as many as 7 times, he suggests. Jesus says, not 7, but I tell you, 77 times. Or your translation you might be familiar with says 70 times 7. It could be interpreted either way. It's a big number, a lot more than 7. Whatever that formula is, Jesus seems to be saying the point is not the number. Rather, forgive so often that you lose count. That's the calculus of forgiveness. But if you keep a scorecard, that tends you towards legalism and judgmentalism. Peter was being gracious, though. Let's give him credit. 7 times was a big number for forgiveness. In that day and time, as the Jewish mother would teach the boy, 3. 3 was kosher. You know, we've got this in our society, like 3 strikes and you're out. It's not just about baseball, it's about behavior, right? It's about legality. So Peter was being very gracious, but he was still calculating. He was still looking for a tolerable limit. And Jesus seems to be saying, the calculus of God's grace is unlimited. It is that unconditional love, that forgiveness of, God of second chances and 100 second chances, or 1,000 second chances in my case, thanks be to God. And so he tells him, you know how Jesus teaches? He doesn't just say, here's what you need to know. He'll give you a story, and stories are powerful because they help us to think, they help us to get beyond ourselves, and to remember. Here's a memorable parable, Matthew 18, verse 23. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. He began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents. 10,000 was the largest number in their language, in their minds. It was brought to him, verse 25, he could not pay. The Lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him and said, have patience with me and I will pay you everything. Out of pity, or compassion, we would say, the Lord of that slave released and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, said, pay what you owe me. Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. But he refused, and he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported it to their Lord. All had taken place. Verse 32, the Lord summoned him and said, you wicked slave, I forgave all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay the entire debt. So my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Really mean it. That ends pretty rough, doesn't it? But the point is made, I think. 10,000 being the biggest number they could conceive of meant this man had no physical way. He didn't have the time in a lifetime to ever earn that and pay it back. In this story, the sums of money are extreme. Because Peter had asked, about counting. And so Jesus wanted to give something that's beyond count. We can't count the number of millions. Dr. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary on this passage, had figured out somehow that the sum of money would be around 10 million in today. Well, with inflation last year, let's just go ahead and say 10.6 million. I mean, it was a lot of money. But, for us today, 10.6 million, that's not the biggest number. I mean, I teased around the other day because, Forbes magazine puts out the richest people in the world and who wins that every February. But for me, it's not the person. It's just the numbers are beyond my imagination. Remember when $1 billion was a lot of money? I don't know. If you work for the government, maybe it never was. Maybe 100 years ago. But the world's richest people today, there are families, women, and men who have billions, plural. And 200 billion, you could put that in here if this would help you understand this. $200 billion. I mean, you could mortgage your place. You're not going to come up with, most of us, looking around the room, no, I don't think any of us are going to come up with 200 billion if we put it all together, what you have, what I have, everything. So it's this sense of no human way possible to earn this forgiveness of debt, this grace, this gift. No way to repay it. Then he goes out and he shakes down the first person he sees who owes him money. Where's my $2? Okay? So this other amount of money, 100 denarii, let me not try to translate it exactly, but let's use it for hyperbole, for shock's sake. It's like shaking him down for $2. Pay me back that $2 you owe me. Maybe it's 20. 20 would make more sense in our day, right? Can't buy anything for $2. So what's the point here? Forgiveness, you can't pay it back, but you are expected to pay it forward, right? You're not going to repay God for all the sins God's already forgiven you for. But there is this idea that God has, well, at least you should share it. If I give it to you as a gift, why not share it with others, right? Then you could say that about love, you could say that about grace. Certainly, the point is about forgiveness, mercy, reconciliation. So if we, the church, are going to preach a gospel message of mercy and forgiveness and reconciliation, we need to embody it. This whole chapter seems to be saying, be humble like a child and be forgiving like your Father is merciful and forgiving. Again, this message that Jesus teaches, sort of the calculus of grace, is not about counting up all the wrongs or all the sins, but trusting God, and that your righteousness should be a higher righteousness than the leaders of their current religion in Israel. Jesus had said this in Matthew 5, the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. It's going to be more than just being legalistic. It's more than the law that said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That doesn't make us even. That just makes us toothless, right? And hard of seeing. So it really is about sharing grace more than had ever been expected of people in that day and time. So I'm looking at my watch. If you've got the ears to hear, I think I have the breath to speak into chapter 19. Let's see how far we can go. It's fun. It's like a discovery, right? We're on an adventure together because these tie together. Listen, 19, verse 1, when Jesus finished saying these things, he left Galilee, went into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he cured them there. So Jesus continues to do healing miracles. Verse 3, chapter 19 of Matthew. Some Pharisees came, tested him, and said, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and a mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." And they said to him, "Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" He said to them, "It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, marries another, commits adultery, and he who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, Jesus has these high expectations for his followers, for living a life that is spiritual and moral more than the religious leaders. Again, the higher righteousness as we find in the Sermon on the Mount. The religious leaders then, they all participated in, actually celebrated divorce. These men were the men in power. These were the inside the beltway, leaders of the whole nation of Israel. And they were, as kind of a practice back then, taking advantage of women and divorcing them for whatever reason, right? Can you imagine a society where divorce is fairly commonplace and could be, really for almost any reason at all, irreconcilable difference? I'm not judging you, anybody who's got a divorced person in their family. Like I know a lot of divorced people in my church and everything. So it's not a judgment. I'm just saying in our culture today, it may feel a bit like it must have been back then, where it seemed to be done quite regularly, but particularly then, the men in power, and using it as a way to get out of responsibilities. There were no social safety nets. A divorced woman was immediately poor. You didn't have a good divorce attorney. You didn't split things 50-50 or what have you. So it was a way that, unfortunately, women were taken advantage of more than anybody else. Women and children suffered from it greatly. Interesting. We could spend hours debating the issues of divorce right here. We won't, don't worry. There have been, quite a history of cases about, the religious view of divorce. And in fact, when Jesus speaks 2,000 some years ago when he taught this, he was entering into a stream of debate about divorce. There were religious, different points of views, debates among rabbis, not for a few centuries, but for millennia, going all the way back to Moses, probably predating Moses. Anyway, we're not going to get into all those things. Some of them were using, I'll quote, displeasing actions of a wife. For example, once she was seen loosening her hair in public. So these were grounds for divorce. I don't know if loosening the hair was a euphemism for like flirting or something like this, but there were just all sorts of reasons cited that men could use to divorce a wife who did anything that a man didn't like. But there were, just literally centuries and centuries of interpretive debate about the scriptures regarding marriage and divorce. So we're in a similar time, maybe with different issues about it, but people continue to debate marriage and so on. Here's the thing that struck me. Jesus just jumps right in to answer their question without citing any of that religious debate history among the rabbis, which again would infuriate those leaders who just were interrogating him. Because Jesus goes where? Straight to the source. He doesn't go back to Moses. He goes and, above Moses' head, if you will, to God directly. And says, don't you know, it was God's gift from the beginning. Marriage was blessed by God from the beginning, right? Jesus is communicating that God has an unadulterated favor for marriage. So, people, treat it with proper respect, would you? God was there at the very beginning to conduct the first marriage ceremony and walked the bride Eve down the Garden of Eden aisle to marry Adam. So it's a blessing, and treat it with such sacred respect. Now, the Pharisees, the legalists who came to interrogate Jesus, like many people who argue religion or politics, they really weren't interested in the truth themselves or in learning anything different than they already felt. They were merely interested in defending themselves, proving themselves right, and having to show that they would win the point, that they were right. Yeah, have you ever heard of anybody act that way? But anyhow, that's just what was going on. And so you could tell by the end of this story, they were not pleased with Jesus' teaching. Again, he takes head on the conventional wisdom and the human traditions of his day. And this is, again, fodder for those who are opponents of Jesus, ready to have him arrested, and it's getting closer to that moment. Verse 10, so the disciples are scratching their heads about this. They're young men, right? Probably none of them married, maybe only Peter. And they're curious about this. Verse 10, if such is the case of a man and his wife, is it better not to marry? But he said to them, not everyone can accept this teaching, only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who've been made eunuchs by others. There are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. Well, that was strange. Okay, do you want me to clear that up? I'll try. To marry or not to marry? This is the question, right, that the disciples were asking. Oh my goodness, it sounds pretty scary. Well, the church has had different interpretations over the centuries about marriage, divorce, certainly, about celibacy, which seems to be what Jesus is pointing at here. Marriage is for the vast majority of people, but there are some who are different. Jesus kind of lumps them all together in a category. He says eunuchs. I mean, that was understood at that time. You think about a male who's been castrated, or, wonderful to sing in the boys' choir, but it is not, a suitable life to be married. So Jesus is saying there will be exceptions to traditional marriage. The eunuch being the example he lifts up. Some are born that way. Some are made eunuchs by others. Some choose for a spiritual reason, though. He's talking about for a spiritual reason, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. If you can accept a life of celibacy in this way, okay. And allow others to do so if they choose. Now, the way the church over the centuries, majority of Christians, not everybody, but the majority of Christians have understood this to be part of the call of the sacred vow of the priests in the Roman Catholic tradition, to be celibate. I don't know if that's good or bad. We've got some evidence today that that may not be suitable for some of them. So it's a difficult teaching. But Jesus seems to be allowing for differences of interpretation right there. Some will choose to renounce sex. Some will renounce even wealth. He's going to point to that in the next section. So these things roll together, and Jesus seems to be saying, I'm expecting of my people a higher way of living, higher way of being spiritual or moral in the world. And some are choosing not to marry, but it should be for a religious reason. But we should also be tolerant of that. So again, he cuts against the conventional wisdom, cuts against the grain of the culture that is all about family and, certainly prospering. So imagine those young men hearing Jesus' speech about the eunuchs, and their jaws would have been dropped because they knew their grandmother and their Jewish mother had already told them the first thing you do is you get married. That's a faithfulness to God, and have some children. That was the first mitzvah in Genesis chapter 1. Be fruitful and multiply, right? So this was the way it was supposed to be, and Jesus is saying there'll be some exceptions. And that was shocking to hear that sort of grace. That's sort of allowing some to choose differently. So it wouldn't be a shame, if Jesus was not married himself. We don't know. We don't know. It would have been shocking for him to be 33 years old and not to have been married, but we don't have any scriptural evidence, so I won't bring that up. I'm just saying that if you follow his own teaching, it shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have mattered if Jesus was married or not, because he has this right here. So again, it was against the great structure of society, the family, the home, even marriage. He seems to both support it and usurp it simultaneously. What is going on? Well, let's read on. He brings children into the mix again. Of course. Marriage, divorce, children, right? Verse 13. Children were being brought to him in order that he may lay hands on them and pray. His disciples spoke sternly to those who brought him, but Jesus said, "Let the children come to me. Do not stop them, for it is such these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." He laid hands on them and went on his way. Children are lifted up and included and blessed by Jesus. Again, this was against the current culture of his time, a reminder of what he had taught in the previous chapter: be childlike, be humble. So accept the lowly, those who seem to be overlooked, outcast, the least of these. And children are a good example of all the above. Now, I also want to say something about Bible translations real quick in this case, because in Matthew 19, where it says, "Let the children come to," we read that in our modern English. But this is where I think the King James loses some of its modern impact, because the English language changes. If you read this in the King James, what does it say? "Suffer the little children to come unto me." Who wants children to suffer? Jesus doesn't want the children to suffer. He's already taught about that. But the language changes. So it's another, back in that day, the word suffer meant, allow. The language changes, so I think that we all need to be willing to read the Bible, particularly the gospel, Jesus' teachings, in a modern translation, so we can get more up to date what Jesus is saying. Although I love the King James for the Lord's Prayer. You know that. All right, just a thought on that. Someone came to him and said, "Teacher," I'm in verse 16, Matthew 19. "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And he said, "Why do you ask me what is good? There is one who is good. If you wish to enter life, keep the commandments." And he said, "Which ones?" And Jesus said, "You shall not murder, shall not commit adultery, shall not steal, shall not bear false witness, honor your mother and father. You shall also love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said, "I've kept all of these. What still do I lack?" Jesus said, if you wish to be perfect, there's that word, we'll come back to it. Go, sell your possessions, give the money to the poor, you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. When the young man heard his word, he went away grieving, for he had many possessions. Do good. Doing good is the way to enter life. He doesn't even say eternal life, verse 17. But the good life is doing what God would have us do. We all get that. We know the 10 Commandments. So did this young man, and so did Jesus. But when Jesus quotes the 10 Commandments, he quotes several of them. He adds the love your neighbor as yourself, which wasn't in the top 10 of doing good, but Jesus puts it there, right? What did he not say? The first commandment. Jesus did not quote to the man, have no other gods before God. The young man did have one, didn't he? He had an idol, his wealth, and Jesus knew that. And he spoke to that in this way. And he says, well, if you want to be perfect. Now, we've talked about that word. Don't trip over that word. In our modern English, it's really difficult. We see perfection as unattainable. So what Jesus means, as I talked about back in Matthew chapter 5 when he says this, Sermon on the Mount context, be greater than what others consider the good and right way to follow these commandments. Have a higher way of being spiritual in relationship with God, in relationship to others. So continually strive to improve yourself, not judging others so much, but yourself. Be pretty hard on yourself to move yourself closer to God, closer to others, and following as many of these as you possibly can. If you want to have that higher righteousness that Jesus is talking about, then you might want to renounce your wealth, because for you, young man, this is your stumbling block. This is the idol that you've set up greater than God. Come follow me. And he didn't like any of that. He didn't want to sell his possessions. But what Jesus has said before about the eunuchs, right? Some may choose to renounce sex. Some may choose to renounce wealth. There will be some who do this. And this may not be for all. You know, same thing. The vast majority of people are going to have a traditional marriage. That's going to work for the vast majority. The vast majority of us are going to have some sort of traditional relationship with our finances. That is, we're going to be good people. We're going to follow the rules. We'll pay our taxes. We'll give to God what we believe is right to give to God, or at least some of us will, right? That certainly seems to be less frequent these days and times, said the preacher. But people have a choice here, okay? And there will be some who will give up all possessions. It wasn't for this particular young man, and it's not for very many. But you may know somebody, as I've known somebody, who has renounced their wealth, changed their lifestyle entirely, given over the top generously to God's kingdom, to the least of these, and so on. So that is one of the ways of following Jesus. Let's see what else he says. Chapter 19, verse 23. Jesus said to his disciples, truly I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astounded and said, who then can be saved? And Jesus looked at them and said, for mortals it's impossible, but for God all things are possible. A camel through the eye of a needle. Again, the extremes, what Jesus does with hyperbole, he thinks of the largest animal that was known to them then. Okay, for all the disciples, they were familiar with the camel. It's bigger than your livestock. It's the biggest animal that they would have in their minds. And what's the smallest place? What's the hardest, straight and narrow thing to find that perfect way? Oh, the eye of the needle would be like the smallest thing they could imagine. And so he was using hyperbole. It wasn't supposed to be literal. Now, I've heard a lot of different you probably have heard many pastors, different interpretations preaching on this. Oh, the eye of the needle was a place, that it was like a narrow mountain pass that went between these two rocky cliffs, and it was very hard to take your camel there, so most people just went on foot. But the eye of the needle was referring to a place. Maybe, I don't know. I wasn't there, and I don't think anybody has any archaeological evidence for that. I think Jesus meant it just to be shocking. It's not possible. One of my professors at Duke, later became Bishop Will Willimon. I love the way he said it in a sermon just so frankly. Oh, it's possible. It's just really hard on the camel. I mean, think about what you have to do for the camel. You basically have to cut it up and burn it down, just sift the ashes through. It's possible. But it's got to be transformed. You know, I think it would be possible for that young man to give up all his possessions, but he would have to be completely transformed, right? You know, there's just that whole thing. Honestly, I'll boil it down to this. After looking at this in so many different lights, I think Jesus is really saying in a lot of these teaching moments in these 2 chapters, it's not humanly possible. Salvation is God's work. Okay? So who can be saved? You know, who can survive marriage? I was teasing with somebody in the church hallway after my sermon on Sunday, you know, that I'm not so great if you come to me to do a wedding, because as I look back over 25 years, I mean, about half the people I've married have gotten a divorce, right? And if half of marriages end in divorce, which is not a great success rate, just remember, the other half have to end in death. Oh, that's not very helpful. Well, we hope natural death. Natural death, not a homicide with one spouse angry at the other. But what is my point? Well, my point is, by the way, I'm batting 1,000 with funerals. Okay? Nobody's ever come back from the dead on me. 100% successful with funerals, not so great with marriages. But it happens, right? Humanity. It happens that we have divorce. It happens that we fail. And we try our best to forgive and be reconciled. But at the end of the day, trust God. Because you're not going to, I'm not going to, none of us are, even together, going to even be close to perfect. We're not going to be able to attain all these things. We're the camel trying to go through the needle's eye. That straight and narrow is just too narrow for us. However, salvation is God's work. Receive it as God's gift. Be grateful that God has uncalculable forgiveness points in your favor, right? That you're not sitting there trying to earn your way out of a debt of $200 billion. That the King we serve forgives all our debts. And all he's saying is, well, why don't you just share a little bit of that which I gave you? Why don't you just love with a little bit of that love that I've given you? How about you reconcile with that reconciliation I've made perfect for you in Jesus Christ, not in your own ways, which are, like I've admitted, so less than perfect. Well, the point is not our human effort. The point is God's great gift of salvation and forgiveness and grace. It's greater than any worldly wealth. All right, wrapping it up in chapter 19. We got it. We can do this. Verse 27. Peter said in reply, look, we followed left everything to follow you. What then will we have? Well, Jesus says, truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man is seated on his throne in glory, you have followed me. You who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or fields for my name's sake will receive 100-fold, will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. All right, so the reversal of values, again, shows up. That Jesus seems to come full circle to that question about what is great or who is great. Or what does it mean for me to be great? Well, be humble. You know, again, at the end, you do all of this spiritually with a heart to God. Do this for the kingdom of heaven, not your own kingdom. For the kingdom of God's sake. Then absolutely, there's an eternal reward. Thanks be to God for that. But during this life, you know, Jesus has now set his face towards the cross. He's pointing out some of these great difficulties. Even human relationships are difficult for believers, for followers of Jesus. You know, so it could be your marriage, it could be, you know, some of your spiritual relationships, friends in the church even sometimes don't reconcile, sometimes people go astray, sometimes they lose their faith and they walk away. All these things happen. We are less than perfect, but God forgives and God has ultimately a wonderful paradise prepared for you and I who follow Jesus. So he does give us that assurance of ultimate eternal life. Thanks be to God. It's a gift. It's not something we can earn, not something we do by being good. And in fact, the last shall be first. Can I give you one of my own personal examples? This is just real quick, just for a little tongue-in-cheek. So I'm in the running community. I like to do mountain trail runs, particularly if we can do a marathon or longer than a marathon, like an ultra marathon. I had run this 31-mile race in the mountains near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, up on the Appalachian Trail a couple years ago with a preacher friend of mine from here in Ashburn. So we drove up together. Our friends from Winchester came up 81 to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area and got stuck at 4 o'clock in the morning in some construction traffic where they had shut down lanes and everything. So they were over an hour late to the start of the race. So my friend and I had finished, and these are like long. These are 4 to 6 or even 8 hours in length, these races. I really don't run them. I kind of speed walk or hike a lot of the time, run downhill. Anyway, my friend Russ, who came from Winchester, started an hour late. He was the last man on the course. So we're all there, 50 of us left, out of the hundreds of people who've already come and gone. We're all waiting for the last people to finish the course. And here he comes, age 66, across the finish line, and everybody's cheering. All right, the last person is off the trail. The race is over, and he wins first place. How did that happen? I said, this is great, Russ. The last shall be first. Jesus said it, and here you are, a living example. Sure enough, he was the only guy that old who ran it at all that day. So he won first place in his category, his age category, even though he was the last person on the trail. Took him over 8 hours to complete, but he did it, which was just a great achievement, by the way, for him to run ultra marathon. But nonetheless, he won the medal. It's really kind of exciting. Last shall be first in the race of faith. What does that mean? You may feel, some of you, hopefully you don't feel as bad as I do, but sometimes you may feel like I do, like I am the worst sinner. Like when Paul says, I'm the chief among sinners. I'm like, no, I could give Paul a run for his money on that, because no one knows me like I do, and nobody knows me like my Father in heaven. But I believe Jesus loves you. Jesus forgives you, because if he can forgive me, he can forgive anybody. The last shall be first, right? Thanks be to God for this grace. Amen.